Hi, students. Mrs. George here. Today, what I'd like to talk to you about is the idea of ecological succession. And when we talk about ecological succession, we're basically talking about natural or gradual changes in the types of plants and animal species that inhabit a particular area. And essentially, what happens here is there's a gradual replacement of one type of plant community by another type of plant community through natural processes over time. So let's take a look at exactly what ecological succession involves. First of all, there are two kinds of ecological succession, and they are different based on how everything starts. The first kind of ecological succession is called primary succession. Primary succession starts with bare rock and no soil. So it's basically the development of an ecosystem starting from bare rock where there has been no growth before. So we're starting with bare rock and no soil. That's different from secondary succession. Secondary succession is basically the recovery of an ecosystem after some kind of a natural disaster, like a flood, a fire, or a volcanic eruption or something. And basically, what that does is it destroys an existing ecosystem. But the difference between the secondary succession and the primary succession is that in secondary succession, the soil already exists. And if you recall, in primary succession, we started out with bare rock. So in primary succession, there's no soil. In secondary succession, soil already exists. All right, so let's talk about the specifics of what happens here. In primary succession, if you start out with bare rock, and bare rock can even be volcanic rock from a volcano erupting or a new island in the ocean being created by a volcano, it basically starts out with bare rock. Once the bare rock is there, you have what are called pioneer species. Pioneer species are the first stage of plants to colonize bare rock. And they're things like mosses and lichens. And the key thing about mosses and lichen is that they both have chemicals in their roots that break rocks down. So not only are rocks breaking down here, but as these pioneer species start dying, they start creating organic matter. And that's the beginning of the soil. Okay, so that's basically how soil first starts. If you've ever looked at a cement driveway or something like that, and you see like moss or little weeds growing up in between the cracks, well, here's the thing, the moss is breaking the cement down because it has chemicals in its roots. And as the cement breaks down, you get different weeds that start to grow in that space. So that's kind of like what's happening here in this idea of succession. So bare rock has moss and lichen with chemical in its roots, basically starting to break down the bare rock. And as it dies, the moss and the lichen add organic matter that basically starts soil creation. And as the soil is created, now you can have grasses and herbs and all come in and grow there. And as they die, they add organic matter to make the soil deeper. That allows, slightly bigger shrubs to be there. The bigger shrubs die out, and they make the soil even deeper. And basically, if you look at this order, you'll notice that as the soil depth gets lower and lower, as there's more soil being created, the plants are getting taller and taller because their roots are going to reach down even further. So if you look at this early stage here, there's no way that this much soil would be able to support a tree, okay? Because there's not enough soil there for the roots to go down into. You have to have a thick layer of soil for tree roots to be able to go into that. All right, so those are the pioneer species, the mosses and lichens. So once the mosses and lichens have started developing that soil, and then the grasses and the herbs all come in, they start to grow, they start to die out, they add to the soil. Then we have taller trees that are starting to emerge. This section here is what we would call the intermediate community. okay, where you have your shrubs and your smaller trees, your pine trees, your spruce trees, those kinds of things. And here's another diagram that does a good job of showing what this stage is like. It gradually goes through from bare rock, broken down by the lichen and moss. You get those annuals, the herbs, the short grasses. You get taller grasses and weeds in there. You get small shrubs in there. You get shorter trees. Finally, you end up with a climax community. This is the most stable of all of the communities within an ecosystem. This is called the climax community. The climax species are the last and most stable stage of plant species, and that remains for as long as the site remains undisturbed. It's the most shade tolerant species of trees that are established there. So your oaks and your maples and all of that. And by the way, just so you know, organisms that live within this succession, the size of the organisms get bigger and bigger and bigger as the size of the plants get bigger and bigger and bigger. So initially, you may start out with very tiny beetles and stuff like that. They grow bigger, and you might have small mammals that are in there until you get larger mammals and so on in your climax community. So as the plants are developing, your animal species are coming in there as well. There are different kinds of climax communities depending on what the biome is like. So, for a desert, the climax community may involve cacti. For the beach climax community, there may be certain types of shrubs there. The grassland climax community might involve some kind of short trees. And then the taiga climax community involves the conifers. So, depending on what biome you're in, the climax community may be a little bit different. Now, how this changes when you have secondary succession is that you already have soil there. So, you're not going to basically start out with that moss and lichen. In fact, when it comes to secondary succession, the pioneer species start out a little further on with your grasses. And as a result, secondary succession takes place much faster simply because soil already exists there. Time doesn't need to be taken for the soil to be formed. So notice that the time for secondary succession is considerably less from the time of primary succession. Primary succession will take hundreds of years, whereas a secondary succession may be like 150 years. Okay, so if you have any questions, post it on the question sheet. If they are more involved questions, please send me an email.